This course is about what logicians call valid reasoning. As a first approximation, that means perfectly secure, airtight reasoning. So, for an example, suppose that someone already accepts that all toddlers love Sesame Street and that all toddlers love Paw Patrol. And now, suppose that from those claims, they go on to draw the conclusion that all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol. If the starting claims here are true, then clearly the conclusion drawn from them must also be true. Maybe the starting claims are not true. In fact, we can say pretty definitively that neither of the starting claims here are actually true, since, of course, there are at least some toddlers that don't love Sesame Street and some that don't love Paw Patrol. Some toddlers don't even know what those shows are. But if those starting claims were true, then the conclusion would have to be correct as well. So there's no leap of logic here at all. You could not possibly be wrong about this conclusion as long as your starting claims here were correct. That makes this an example of what logicians call valid reasoning. By contrast, suppose that having reached the conclusion that all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol, the person now goes on from there to draw the conclusion that all toddlers love Bluey, which is another popular children's show. Now, even if it's true that all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol, it doesn't automatically have to be true that they all love this different show, Bluey. So here the person did make a kind of leap of logic. Here the person is taking a bit of risk in drawing this conclusion. Even if they're right that all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol, they could still be wrong about all toddlers loving Bluey. So in the terminology that we would use as logicians, we would say that the inference step from the third claim to the fourth is not valid, whereas the inference step from the first two claims to the third is valid. Another example. Suppose someone accepts that Aaron has a 1-year-old twin sister, and suppose that from there they conclude that Aaron has a sibling. Here, the conclusion automatically follows. It's guaranteed to be true, supposing that the starting claim is true. So this is another instance of valid reasoning. By contrast, suppose the person who accepts that Aaron has a 1-year-old twin sister goes on from there to draw the conclusion that Aaron shares his bedroom. Here, the conclusion does not automatically follow. Sure, typically young twins would sleep in the same room, so assuming that Aaron has a 1-year-old twin sister, it's pretty likely that he shares a room with her, and so pretty likely that he shares his bedroom, but that's not guaranteed. Even if Aaron has a 1-year-old twin sister, his family might put them in different rooms. So a person who made this inference would be taking at least some risk. Their conclusion could still be wrong, even if their starting claim is true. So this would not be an instance of valid reasoning as logicians use that term. Now, your overall aim in this course is essentially to master this notion of valid reasoning. And I do eventually want to say a little bit about why that's a worthwhile thing to strive for. But first, I want to say more about what makes an inference step valid as opposed to not valid, because the characterization we've given so far is a little bit rough. Why do I say that we've so far only given a rough characterization of what valid reasoning is? What's unclear about how we've characterized it so far? Well, as one example to illustrate the issue, suppose that someone reasons in this way. Amanda is the President of the United States. Thus, Amanda is over 12 years old. Is this valid reasoning? On the one hand, someone could easily say, look, if the first claim is true, then the second has to be true as well. If you're right about this starting claim, there's no way you could be wrong about the conclusion. So the inference step from 1 to 2 is valid. On the other hand, someone could say, well, I understand that the law prohibits a 12-year-old from being president. And even if that law were somehow ignored and a 12-year-old was allowed to run for president, it's extremely, extremely unlikely that they would be elected. But all that's theoretically possible, right? We can at least imagine such a thing occurring. So couldn't we say that even if the first claim is true, that doesn't absolutely guarantee that the second claim is true, and so this inference is not valid? Based on the definition we provided so far of what valid reasoning is, it's perfectly secure, airtight reasoning, there's no clear answer in this case. So we're going to clarify the definition of valid reasoning in the following way. When we say that an inference from some starting claims to a conclusion is a valid inference, we mean that it's impossible, in the sense that it's not even coherently imaginable to have a situation where all the starting claims are true and yet the conclusion is false. So consider again the inference from Amanda is the President of the United States to Amanda is over 12 years old. We will not be counting this as valid reasoning because a situation where the starting claim is true and the conclusion is false is at least coherently imaginable. We can at least make sense of a situation where the starting claim is true, but the conclusion is not. By contrast, consider this inference again. All toddlers love Sesame Street. All toddlers love Paw Patrol, so all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol. In this case, supposing that the starting claims are true, one can't even imagine the conclusion being false. Supposing that the starting claims are true and that the conclusion is false is just incoherent. So this does count as valid reasoning under our newly clarified definition. So valid reasoning, as we have defined it, means reasoning where it's not even coherently imaginable for you to be wrong about your conclusion, supposing that your starting claims are correct. That makes valid reasoning very conservative, risk-free reasoning. Now, even with the clarification we added, someone might say that our characterization of valid reasoning still leaves something to be desired because they find it vague or unclear what is meant by coherently imaginable. But it seems like a clear enough definition to work with, and it's as precise as we can get for now. So we'll just move forward using this definition. Now, if you just concentrate on the examples that we've given so far, you might think that once you get clear on the definition of valid reasoning, figuring out whether a particular piece of reasoning is valid or not is pretty easy. All toddlers love Sesame Street, all toddlers love Paw Patrol, thus all toddlers love both Sesame Street and Paw Patrol is valid reasoning. You can't coherently imagine a situation where the starting claims are true, but the conclusion is not. Aaron has a 1-year-old twin sister, thus Aaron shares his bedroom is not valid reasoning. You can at least imagine a situation where the starting claim is true, but the conclusion is not. But if you have the impression that it's always easy to tell whether a particular bit of reasoning is valid or not, that's an illusion caused by the fact that so far we've just been focusing on simple examples. There are actually a number of pretty thorny problems that you run into when you start considering a greater variety of cases. As an example to illustrate one of those problems, suppose that someone reasons like this: Ben is not helpful and mean, thus Ben is mean. Is this valid reasoning? Well, it depends on how you read the premise or starting claim. One possibility is that it's saying Ben is both unhelpful and mean, in which case the reasoning is Ben is both unhelpful and mean, thus Ben is mean. It's impossible to envision a scenario where that starting claim is true, but the conclusion that Ben is mean is false. So on this reading of it, the reasoning is valid. But there's another way of reading the premise, which is that it's taking the claim that Ben is both helpful and mean, which would be a somewhat strange combination, and it's saying that it isn't true that Ben has both qualities. In that case, the reasoning is, it isn't true that Ben is both helpful and mean. He might have one quality or the other, but he doesn't have both at once. Thus, Ben is mean. Here, it is possible to envision a scenario where the starting claim is true, but the conclusion is not. All we have to do is imagine that Ben is helpful and not mean at all. In that case, it isn't true that Ben is both helpful and mean, because he's not mean, so the starting claim is true, and the conclusion that Ben is mean in the scenario we just imagined is false. So on this reading of it, the reasoning is not valid. So in this case, we couldn't just give a simple yes or no answer to the initial question, is this reasoning valid? We actually had to take a step back first and clarify exactly what reasoning was intended, because there was some ambiguity in how the reasoning was originally expressed. The starting claim could be interpreted in two importantly different ways. This is a general problem that pops up quite a bit when you start trying to answer the question, is this reasoning valid? You find that there are importantly different ways to understand what the reasoning at issue actually is, and you can't make a judgment about the validity of the reasoning until you first clarify how it's supposed to be understood. Because of that problem, we'll actually put a great deal of effort into developing precise ways of writing out statements so that the question of how exactly to understand them doesn't arise. There's a separate problem that's also worth mentioning, which we could illustrate with another example. So suppose that someone reasons as follows: if Plato's not a poet, then no one's a poet. No poet lacks a passionate heart. Not everyone fails to be a poet, so Plato has a passionate heart. Is this valid reasoning? There's no troublesome ambiguity in any of the claims involved here, but still, it's not immediately obvious whether the conclusion follows from the premises. If you think about it for a bit, you could probably figure it out, but even in that case, you'll just be figuring it out in some ad hoc way that happens to occur to you in the moment. You might make a mistake. If you encounter another example that's a little more complicated, you might just get stuck. So it would be really nice to have some kind of step-by-step procedure that we could apply over and over again that would always tell us whether the reasoning is valid or not, because sometimes the reasoning is too complicated to just figure it out off the top of your head. So in this course, we'll also work hard at developing general procedures that can be used to figure out whether a bit of reasoning is valid once it's been characterized precisely and unambiguously. Now, finally, why all this focus on valid reasoning? Why work so hard at being able to distinguish between reasoning that's valid and reasoning that's not? One reason has to do with your skills as a critic. To figure out what you should believe, whether you're engaged in an academic pursuit like studying history or chemistry or math, or just thinking about the issues of the day in your society, you have to be able to assess the strength of the reasons being offered to you. You have to be able to think carefully about whether the conclusion being argued for really does follow from the considerations being offered in support of it. And if not, what extra assumptions would be needed to get the conclusion to follow. Another reason has to do with your skills as an advocate, as someone who themselves sometimes wants to persuade or convince. If you want to make a good argument, you have to give reasons that are compelling. You have to make sure that you're giving reasons which really do support the conclusion that you're arguing for. The more you master the difference between valid and invalid reasoning, the better you'll be at that. Now, in this course, you won't practice applying your logical knowledge either as a critic or as an advocate, in the sense that you won't be assessing real world arguments in philosophy or history or biology, nor will you be crafting your own, but you will be building the core foundational critical thinking skills that you need in order to do that well.